On my direct right is Mark Little, ex of RTE, now of Storyful, a company that was bought by News roughly 2 years ago. And so he's got experience of insurgent upstart and indeed a legacy news organisation. Alison Gow, who interestingly during the break said to me that public policy in an Irish accent sounds way more interesting than an English one. And she said if she'd been listening to those people with an English accent, she would have been bored shitless. That's not to be used. I hope the same goes for moderators with a semi-Irish accent anyway. And we also have Malachy Brown from Reportedly and Mark Keane, Insight and Chair of Computer Science at UCD. So I've asked the four participants to start with 3 to 4 minutes just on their own observations on the future of journalism's, things that we should be thinking about, things that we should be looking at, and their own observations on what they do in their professional life. Mark, if you'll kick us off. Mark's just arrived from New York, so if he nods off during this discussion, somebody can give him a nudge, or me.
Yeah, I was actually realizing coming out here, something the column about, it was 25 years ago I was in DCU learning shorthand. Reel-to-reel cutting of tape. I remember seeing our first mobile phone was the size of a suitcase. I remember getting on the bus, on the 16 bus with someone. We all stared at it, looking at it, thinking, mobile phone? So that's how old. Never catch on. Yeah. But I just say that to give you a background to where I came from, which is a very traditional background. I suppose just to address the question about the future of news, for me, one of the disappointing things I think about the debate has been how we've concentrated on the wrong things to an extent. Technology, for example. You know, technology is meaningless without the human behavior that it creates. And I think in many ways we're focusing on the new app or how the iPhone works, when in fact we're not realizing the fundamental revolutionary shift in the way that news is created over the past 8 years since the birth of the camera phone. It used to be that you have to have a printing press. You had to have a satellite dish or a radio transmitter to create and distribute news. But 8 years ago, suddenly all you had to have was a camera phone and a connection to a social network, which meant that everybody was a storyteller. And in many ways, journalists themselves were disempowered because the audience, or what we used to know as the audience, just bypasses completely. Now, obviously, that created huge opportunities. I was a foreign correspondent at the end of my tenure in RTE, and I had this... Wow, talk about a Freudian slip. To all my RTE former colleagues, that was definitely not intended. But actually, there was an extent I had this whiff of professional mortality when I would see stories. I remember a big one in 2009 in Iran, wasn't covered by the correspondents who were locked away in hotel rooms repeating third-hand rumor. It was being reported by 17-year-olds with camera phones and connections to Twitter. And I remember at that time thinking, first of all, that scares the shit out of me, because as a journalist, I mean, that feels like the end of foreign correspondency. So Storyful, my idea was, if you broke a news agency and started from scratch, like the AP or Reuters, what would it look like? And I realized what it would look like was to just live on the social web, where 300 hours of video is now loaded up on YouTube every single minute. So everybody's a storyteller. And if everybody's a storyteller, who do you listen to? So the first problem we tried to solve was noise. How do you get the signal from the noise? How do you find that tiny fraction of content emerging from the social web, what we call UGC, that can define a narrative, whether it be with the Arab Spring or in Syria or in breaking news stories all over the world, whether it be a brave person, a young person who runs to gunfire when a policeman shooting a black man in North Carolina. You know, that's the kind of significant piece of content that is defining our history. Our organization was set up to find it and get rid of the chaff. The second thing was obviously context is king in this age where content itself is almost valueless, there's so much of it. Journalism has a role in to provide the context and the verification and the story that turns a random piece of content into something that changes the narrative. That was the second thing we did. And finally, speed. We all still need speed. We still need in breaking news situations to be fast, but we also need to be right, more importantly. So I thought breaking news is broken. How could we essentially find a way to supply the publishers with the right content? We built a newswire, which is now in more than 100 newsrooms around the world, from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, all around the world. We, just last week, were announced as YouTube's newswire. So we're now acting on YouTube to find that content. We also do that on Facebook. So essentially the two dominant social powers in the world are using a small company from Mount Street to essentially provide some human curation. We've diversified the business, so now if you've seen a video of a cat skateboarding, Storyful manages the rights of those videos, where we generate 150 million views a month. We've moved into China. And increasingly now we're working with brand newsrooms. Some of the fastest growing newsrooms in the world are people like General Electric, MasterCard, Coca-Cola. So there's a revolution in the advertising business that we're also leveraging. I would just say, just to sum up, I don't want to go too long, to say the big trends that we're watching, we're in this unique position as a business-to-business service that we work with everybody. And what we're noticing more and more is the multiplicity of the debate about paywalls, first of all. This concept that it's a binary choice between putting a paywall up or not having it is ridiculous. You know, we're seeing the development of pay fences, people taking 10, 20 pieces of content before they hit the wall. We're seeing the rise of micropayments, potentially the idea of paying for individual pieces of content. We're seeing publishers who don't tell you, but they actually lift the paywall when there's a massive advertising spend in a year or a special event happens. So the idea that there's these tiny debates going on about whether people will pay for news is wrong. The second thing we're seeing is, again, the revolutionary change in our relationship with advertisers. So we're seeing the rise of sponsorships, memberships. We're seeing the rise of companies like Vice, which is essentially an advertising company masquerading as a journalistic company. So we're seeing these revolutions. We debate Facebook and its power, and its perhaps malign power in some ways. We're missing out the rise of what we call dark social, the rise of messaging services like Snapchat, WhatsApp, which are now the dominant means of communication between a certain generation. We haven't even begun to think about how journalism fits into that, aside from some small experiments. But I think the final thing is our relationship with the audience. I still think we're just missing the notion that this is no longer an audience. We don't broadcast like the voice of God. We don't tell people when to sit down and consume our product anymore. We still kind of think we do, but we don't. People are creating news and distributing news at a time of their choice, on the device of their choice, and we still have not worked out how our product fits into the reality of the audience no longer being an audience.